On the afternoon of February the 9th, 1942, smoke rolled thick over Manhattan's west side. At Pier 88, the air was choked with fire and panic. Sirens wailed down 11th Avenue as thousands of dock workers, firefighters, and sailors fought to contain an inferno consuming one of the largest and most advanced ships in the world, the SS Normandy. The vessel had once been the pride of the French fleet, a floating palace of marble, gold, and Art Deco brilliance. But after France fell to the Nazis in 1940, the United States seized her and rechristened her the USS Lafayette. In the early months of World War II, the Navy began converting her into a troop ship capable of carrying 10,000 men across the Atlantic in just 4 days. She represented American ambition, and in a single afternoon, she was reduced to ruin. Fireboats pumped hundreds of thousands of gallons of water into the blaze, desperate to save what they could. But in trying to drown the flames, they drowned the ship. The weight of the water dragged her onto her port side, and by dawn on February the 10th, the Normandy lay half submerged in the freezing Hudson, a $60 million disaster, her blackened hull jutting out like a tombstone. The Navy immediately launched an investigation. The FBI concluded that an errant spark from a welder's torch had ignited a pile of life jackets, a tragic accident brought on by haste and negligence. But not everyone agreed. Within the 3rd Naval District, Captain Roscoe McFall, the district's chief of intelligence, refused to accept the official story. He suspected sabotage. The timing was too perfect. The damage was too complete. Rumours swept through New York. There was whispers of Nazi agents slipping through the docks, of German sympathisers working among the stevedores. Even President Franklin D. Roosevelt himself received reports suggesting that the Axis, which was the name for the combined forces of Hitler's Nazi Germany, Emperor Hirohito's Imperial Japan, and Italy, under the fascist dictator Mussolini, might have found a way to strike at America's homeland, not with bombs, but with fire. The United States Navy began to fear that the country's greatest harbour, the beating heart of its supply chain, might already be compromised. And they were right, though not in the way that they thought. The danger on the docks didn't come from Berlin or Rome, it came from Brooklyn. When the Normandy caught fire at Pier 88, panic swept through Naval Intelligence. Some suspected Nazi sabotage, others blamed careless workers, but the truth was murkier. The docks were crawling with rumours and divided loyalties. Many of the stevedores and union men were Italian immigrants, and some were known sympathisers of Mussolini's fascist regime. The Navy feared that Axis agents could easily exploit that network, and that America's own harbour might already be in enemy hands. Complicating matters further was the Mafia's control of the waterfront. For years, men like Albert the Mad Hatter Anastasia and his imprisoned boss Charles Lucky Luciano had ruled the piers through extortion, fear, and influence. Longshoremen, union leaders, and shipping bosses all answered directly or indirectly to them. The Navy didn't just face the threat of foreign sabotage, it was also confronting an entrenched criminal empire with the power to shut down the port entirely. Nothing moved in or out of New York Harbour without the Mafia's blessing. They had a complete stranglehold on the waterfront, and they ran everything from unloading cargo to the black market siphoning of war supplies. But Anastasia's ambitions went beyond the waterfront. His grand plan was to make the government so desperate for the Mafia's cooperation that they'd be forced to turn to Luciano himself, the one man who could guarantee order on the piers. In Anastasia's mind, the fire aboard the Normandy would do more than terrify the Navy. It would make Luciano indispensable and perhaps open the door to his release. The Normandy fire forced Washington to confront a reality it could no longer ignore, and that fire became the spark that ignited one of the most secret alliances of World War II, a partnership between the US government and organised crime. By early 1942, the United States was on the back foot. The Pacific had fallen into chaos after Pearl Harbor, and across the Atlantic, a quieter but deadlier war was being lost in the dark waters off the East Coast. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest continuous campaign of the war, and in those early months, America was losing it badly. Between January and May 1942, German U-boats prowling the eastern seaboard sank over 100 Allied ships, tankers, freighters and troop carriers, often within sight of American shores. The U-boat commanders called it Die glückliche Zeit, translated to the happy time in English. American ships sailed alone and brightly lit, their silhouettes visible against the coastlines at night, perfect targets for torpedoes. In a single month, January 1942, the Germans destroyed more than 20 Allied vessels. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the German submarine fleet, calculated that if his U-boats could sink 800,000 tons of Allied shipping per month, Britain would be starved into surrender. By February, they were already destroying over 650,000 tons monthly and were dangerously close to that goal. For the Office of Naval Intelligence, panic was setting in. The Navy couldn't understand how the Germans were operating so efficiently, so far from Europe. Some suspected that German agents were gathering intelligence in New York, feeding information on ship movements directly to the Kriegsmarine, the Navy of Nazi Germany. Others believed fishing trawlers off Long Island were secretly resupplying the submarines. Whatever the truth, the Navy needed answers, and fast. Naval Intelligence dispatched undercover officers to the New York docks, men trained in espionage, not in the brutal rhythms of the waterfront. They tried to blend in with the longshoremen, posing as cargo hands and union men, but it didn't take long for the deception to show. The docks were a closed world, an ecosystem of backbreaking labour, kickbacks and quiet intimidation. Everyone knew who gave the orders, and it wasn't the Port Authority. The longshoremen worked where they were told to work, unloaded what they were told to unload, and kept their mouths shut about everything else. Loyalty was enforced with fists and fear. The Navy's agents never stood a chance. They had the wrong slang, the wrong posture, and the wrong kind of confidence. Their hands were too clean, their clothes too pressed. Within hours, word spread that there were outsiders on the piers asking questions. The longshoremen stopped talking altogether. Some stared them down, others laughed them off the docks. But that silence wasn't born out of ignorance or defiance, it was survival. The men on those piers knew that the waterfront didn't belong to the United States government, it belonged to the Mafia. Every inch of the port was controlled by racketeers who took their cut from every shipment that came through New York Harbor. The gangsters decided who got work, who got paid, and who disappeared. To Naval Intelligence, the threat was suddenly clear. If the Mafia wanted to cripple the war efforts, all it had to do was to close the docks. And if the government wanted to protect them, it would have to find a way to deal with the underworld that already owned them. By 1942, the New York waterfront was a criminal empire in its own right. Every pier, every cargo hold, every labour union was under mob influence. Long before the war, the Mafia had seen the docks for what they were, the city's bloodstream. Whoever controlled the flow of cargo controlled the city itself. But it hadn't always belonged to them. For decades, the Brooklyn waterfront had belonged to the Irish, stretching from Red Hook to Vinegar Hill. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Gangs like the White Hand and its leaders, men such as Denny Meehan, Wild Bill Lovett, and Pegleg Lonergan, ruled the piers with fists, clubs, and union muscle. They controlled hiring, wages, and the flow of cargo through intimidation and loyalty, operating under their own rough code of honour. Their power came from proximity, from knowing every longshoreman by name and every foreman's weakness. The police looked the other way, and City Hall, stacked with Irish ward politicians, rarely interfered. For a time, the docks were theirs completely. That began to change during Prohibition, when alcohol and opportunity flooded the waterfront. The docks became the primary landing ground for contraband liquor, arriving by the barrel from Canada, the Caribbean, and beyond. The White Hand gang began to lose control. They drank as much as they moved, skimming bottles from every shipment that passed through. What had once been organised graft descended into chaos, brawls, betrayals, and headlines that made the city nervous. The waterfront became sloppy, violent, unpredictable, and drunk. The Italians, on the other hand, were different. They stayed sober, quiet, and observant. They learned the rhythms of the docks, who unloaded what, who took bribes, and who carried grudges. They made friends with union stewards, warehouse clerks, and even the truckers who hauled freight inland. Where the Irish had once ruled through brute force, the Italians used patience and precision. They saw the waterfront not as a stage for brawls, but as a marketplace. And when Prohibition turned alcohol into gold, they used their discipline to build an empire that stretched from the piers to the speakeasies of Manhattan. By the mid-1920s, the old Irish dock gangs had been broken, their leaders dead, jailed, or driven from the piers, and the Italians, men like Albert Anastasia and Frankie Yale, had taken control. Anastasia, with his cold efficiency and soldier's temperament, organised the docks like a military operation. Yale, already entrenched in Brooklyn bootlegging, turned the unions into profit centres, and together they professionalised the waterfront rackets, linking them to a wider criminal network that reached into construction, trucking, and municipal politics. But the men now running New York's docks were not born to power. Most had arrived in America as part of a vast wave of Sicilian and southern Italian immigrants seeking escape from famine and corruption. Between 1880 and 1914, more than 4 million Italians crossed the Atlantic, landing in a country that met them with suspicion and hostility. In tenement windows, signs warned no Italians need apply. In the face of that prejudice, the newcomers built their own network of trust, loyalty, and silence. And that silence was called the Code of Omerta, the same code that had governed life and honour in Sicily for centuries. Out of cramped neighbourhoods like Little Italy and the Five Points emerged a new class of American gangster, one who understood both the language of poverty and the logic of capitalism. Those traditions eventually evolved into the American Mafia, and by 1931 it had organised itself into 5 ruling families: Luciano, Genovese, Gambino, Bonanno, and Colombo. And one of their most valuable holdings was the New York waterfront. Millions of dollars worth of goods passed through those piers every day: food, coal, oil, textiles, and munitions. Controlling the docks meant controlling the arteries of the entire nation. The mob decided who worked, who didn't, which ships were unloaded first, and which cargo mysteriously fell off the back of a truck. Every morning before dawn, men lined up outside the hiring halls, which was called the Shape Up. Hundreds of longshoremen, caps pulled low, hands in pockets, waited in silence for their names to be called. The Shape boss, usually a mob appointee, would walk the line slowly, cigarette in mouth, calling out a few familiar names. If a man hadn't paid his dues, or if he had talked too much, his name was never called. A week without work meant a week without food, and everyone knew the rules, and no one spoke them aloud. On the piers, silence was survival. Work on the docks was brutal. A longshoreman might move 100 tons of cargo in a day, frozen meat, ammunition, or barrels of oil, for just a few dollars. Accidents were constant, injuries common, and compensation rare. The police rarely came near the piers. If they did, they came to collect. The unions were supposed to protect the men, but most had long since become subsidiaries of the mob. Kickbacks went up the chain, from stevedores to shop stewards, to union delegates, to capos, and eventually to family bosses, until the waterfront payroll ended up funding gambling halls and nightclubs in Midtown Manhattan. The system was self-reinforcing. Politicians relied on union votes to win elections, police captains relied on union dues and mob payoffs to fund their precincts, city contracts were steered to friendly companies who repaid the favour through kickbacks, campaign donations, and envelopes quietly passed under tables in smoke-filled back rooms. A few reformers did try to intervene, but without the cooperation of the longshoremen, who knew that speaking out meant unemployment, or worse, corruption stayed invisible. Even legitimate businessmen were trapped in the web. Shipping companies and warehouse operators paid tribute to ensure smooth deliveries. Refuse to play along and your cargo might rot on the pier or accidentally catch fire. Play along and you could move goods across the city without interference. Fear and convenience kept everyone compliant. The reach of the waterfront racket stretched far beyond the docks. Judges owed favours, city councilmen accepted donations, and precinct captains who looked too closely were reassigned. Through labour racketeering, the Mafia gained leverage over the city's arteries, not just what came into New York, but also what went out. Nothing moved without a nod from the men who ran the piers. By the eve of World War II, the Mafia's control of the waterfront was absolute. New York's piers handled 70% of America's wartime supplies, and almost all of it passed through mob territory. That made the docks both vital and vulnerable. Thus, they became a paradox, a place where patriotism and corruption shared the same space. In the same week a freighter might unload supplies bound for Europe, another shipment, whiskey, cigarettes or heroin, would vanish into the black market. To the men who ruled the piers, war was just another business opportunity, and when the luxury liner Normandy went up in flames at Pier 88, Naval Intelligence finally realised that America's war effort was resting on criminal foundations. And who they believed was at the centre of that world was Joseph "Socks" Lanza, a broad-shouldered Sicilian who ruled the Fulton fish market with an iron fist. Born in Palermo, Sicily, Lanza immigrated to New York as a young man and found work as a fish handler on Pier 17. One of the three piers called the Fulton Docks, where produce went straight to the Fulton Fish Market at the east end of Fulton Street, near the East River. The Fulton Docks were cold, wet and brutal, a place that began before dawn and reeked of brine and sweat. Every morning, hundreds of men unloaded barrels of mackerel and tuna from boats that had docked overnight. Ice melted into the cracks of the cobblestones, the air buzzed with the shouting of foremen, the crash of wooden crates, and the constant rumble of trucks carrying the day's catch to restaurants and wholesalers across the city. By 1923, Lanza had worked his way up to become an organiser for the United Seafood Workers Union, Local 359. It didn't take him long to realise that real power didn't come from lifting crates, it came from deciding who did. He began shaping the union into his own personal kingdom. Wholesalers who resisted his demands found their fish rotting on the docks, ice trucks broke down, deliveries were delayed, and buyers vanished. In a trade where time meant everything, a few hours of inaction could destroy an entire shipment. Lanza turned that leverage into money and fear. Those who paid him worked in peace, and those who didn't saw their livelihoods collapse overnight. A single word from SOX could freeze the entire market. Federal investigators later estimated that his control of the Fulton docks generated more than $1 million a year in illicit profits. Nearly $20 million a year in today's money. The nickname SOX came from his habit of beating disobedient workers with a length of rubber hose stuffed inside a sock, a weapon that left no marks but delivered excruciating pain. It became a signature of his rule. Everyone knew that Lanza's word was the law, and that defying him came with consequences. By the time the Roaring Twenties were over, Lanza had become more than just a labour racketeer. He was a broker of influence, the man who could make or break shipments that fed half of the city. He had connections to the police, to the press, and to the politicians who ran the Waterfront district. His influence reached beyond the fish market into trucking, cold storage, and even restaurant distribution. If you ate seafood in New York City, chances were it passed through his hands. That kind of control didn't go unnoticed. Lanza's operation caught the attention of the city's criminal elite, and by the early 1930s, he was deeply tied to Lucky Luciano's organisation, eventually becoming part of what would be known as the Genovese crime family. He operated under the protection of mob leaders who valued him not just for his earnings, but for his ability to move goods quietly and efficiently through one of the most important ports in America. Federal agents who tried to investigate the Fulton market described Lanza as one of the most accomplished terrorists in connection with labour racketeering. He didn't need to shout or brandish a gun, his reputation did the work for him. Men spoke his name in low tones. Even seasoned detectives admitted that getting information from the market was nearly impossible. Lanza's control depended on silence, and everyone understood that talking meant unemployment, exile, or death. By 1942, that silence drew the attention of an entirely different kind of investigator. The US Navy was desperate to secure the New York harbour after the Normandy fire and the wave of U-boat attacks off the Atlantic coast. Every supply ship bound for Europe passed through the same piers that Lanza controlled, and while Naval Intelligence had maps, patrols and armed guards, they had no real control over the men who worked the docks. The unions belonged to the mob, so they belonged to Joseph Lanza. So it was Lanza, not Lucky Luciano himself, who first attracted the interest of Navy intelligence. His absolute command over the Fulton fish market made him the Navy's perfect entry point into the underworld. He knew every ship, every dock, every man who worked the harbour. He could find out who was talking, who was stealing, who might be sympathetic to Italy's fascist government, and who could be bought. Through Lanza, the Navy could reach the underworld, and through the underworld, it could reach Luciano. Luciano had been the one who restructured the Mafia in the 1930s, transforming it from a loose collection of rival gangs into a coordinated syndicate that ran like a corporation. But in 1942, he was in a very different position. Locked inside Clinton Correctional Facility and serving 30 to 50 years for compulsory prostitution. And yet, even behind bars, Luciano was still controlling the Mafia. SOX Lanza controlled the fish market, but Luciano was on a whole different level. His influence stretched across every borough, every dock, every union. When the US Navy realized this, it became clear that the only way to secure New York Harbor was through him. To understand why Luciano's name held that kind of power, why men like Lanza still answered to him even from miles away, you have to go back to where it began. Charles Lucky Luciano was born Salvatore Lucania in 1897 in the small Sicilian town of Leccara Fridi, a place of sun-scorched poverty and superstition, where survival itself was a kind of education. When he arrived in New York City in 1906, a 9-year-old immigrant boy stepping off a steerage ship, he joined hundreds of thousands of Italians crammed into the tenements of the Lower East Side. The Lower East Side in the early 20th century was a breeding ground for toughness and ambition. Children grew up among overcrowded slums, gangs and constant noise, where every block was a war zone and the police only came when someone was already dead. Work was scarce, the schools were not welcoming of Italian children, and the streets taught lessons faster than any classroom could. It was an environment that punished weakness and rewarded cunning. From the beginning, Luciano wanted more than just survival, he wanted power. By the age of 10, he was running his own protection racket, charging neighbourhood kids a nickel for protection against beatings. It was during one of these shakedowns that he met a wiry Jewish boy named Meyer Lansky, who refused to pay. Most kids would have been thrashed, but Luciano admired his nerve. That brief standoff began a lifelong partnership, one that would reshape organised crime forever. When Prohibition came into effect in January 1920, opportunity flooded America's underworld. The Volstead Act, Prohibition's official name, banned the manufacture, transportation and sale of alcohol, but not the desire for it. Overnight, ordinary Americans became lawbreakers, and those willing to defy the law became rich. For men like Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky, it was the chance of a lifetime. Both were in their early 20s, sharp, ambitious, and unencumbered by the old codes of Sicilian restraint. They saw that Prohibition was less about morality than it was logistics. It wasn't about who could make liquor, it was about who could move it. As gangs like the White Hand got drunk and killed each other, Luciano and Lansky built a smuggling empire that stretched from Canada to Europe. They partnered with Jewish gangs and Irish mobs who were actually organised, bribed customs agents, and even imported the finest scotch and gin from British distilleries through contacts in Montreal and Scotland. They leased fleets of trucks disguised as milk or produce deliveries and ran underground shipping networks that mirrored legitimate commerce. Everything had an invoice, a ledger, and a chain of command. It wasn't just crime anymore, it was business. By the late 1920s, Luciano was one of the most powerful and wealthiest gangsters in the country. As ruthless as he was pragmatic. He dressed like an executive, thought like one, and treated violence as a last resort rather than a sport. Lansky handled the finances, fixing prices and laundering profits through Havana casinos and European fronts. Together, they modernized the American underworld, turning it from a patchwork of ethnic gangs into a national enterprise. But not everyone shared their vision. The old Mafia leadership still lived by the codes of Sicily, loyal to family, to blood, and to the past. They were known as the Mustache Petes, men who refused to work with non-Sicilians and viewed Luciano's alliances with Jews and Irishmen as betrayal. They still believed in old rituals, the blood oath, the whispered vows before icons of saints, and vendettas that could last generations. Luciano considered them outdated relics. He believed that survival meant adaptation and that power could be shared if profit was guaranteed. The clash between old and new ideals tore the underworld apart. The Castellammarese War of the early 1930s turned New York's Italian underworld into a battlefield. It was fought in alleys, tenements and restaurants, a silent civil war waged with bullets and whispers. Luciano served under Joe, the boss Masseria, a crude, superstitious tyrant who demanded loyalty and tribute, but offered little strategy in return. His rival, Salvatore Maranzano, was no better. Another traditionalist Sicilian mafioso who fancied himself the Julius Caesar of crime. Luciano understood that neither man could lead the modern underworld that he envisioned. So he began playing both sides. In secret meetings with Lansky and Frank Costello, another of Lucky's childhood friends, he planned to end the war by eliminating both bosses. On April the 15th, 1931, Luciano invited Masseria to lunch at the Nuovo Via Tamaro, a Coney Island restaurant. They ate oysters, scampi and pasta with red wine. When Luciano excused himself to the restroom, Luciano henchmen Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis and Vito Genovese walked in. Seconds later, Masseria lay dead on the floor, his playing cards scattered and his hands still clutching an ace of spades. 5 months later, Luciano turned on Maranzano. The new boss of bosses, as Maranzano deemed himself, had begun plotting Luciano's assassination, calling him too ambitious and too American. Luciano, however, struck first. In September 1931, gunmen disguised as tax agents stormed Maranzano's Park Avenue office and shot and stabbed him to death. The purge that followed became known as the Night of the Sicilian Vespers, and dozens of old world dons were murdered across New York and the rest of America. The Mustache Petes were finally finished. In their place, Luciano divided their empires and built something new, the Commission. It was a governing council of America's criminal families, designed to settle disputes without violence and divide territories like corporate shareholders. Each family was granted autonomy over its own region, but all major decisions required approval from the board. It was democracy in crime, and it worked. The 5 families, Luciano's own family, which is now the Genovese crime family, Lucchese, Mangano, which is now the Gambino crime family, Bonanno and Profacci, which is now the Colombo crime family, became the pillars of organised crime in America. Beneath them, lesser gangs across the country paid tribute or aligned themselves as subsidiaries. For the very first time, the American Mafia had structure, order, and national reach. Luciano's genius was recognising that violence was bad for business, because where previous bosses had ran through fear, he ruled through consensus and profit. Disputes were arbitrated rather than avenged. Alliances were cemented through cash rather than blood. His board meetings took place in hotel suites rather than in saloons. His subordinates were allowed to wear suits instead of street clothes. Reporters began calling him the head of the American Mafia. And they were right. By 1936, Luciano was the undisputed architect of organised crime in America. He wore handmade suits, smoked English cigarettes, and kept a private residence on an entire floor of the Waldorf Astoria, the most exclusive address in New York, where his empire of gangsters, gamblers and politicians met with him behind closed doors. He invested in nightclubs, dog tracks and construction companies, using legitimate fronts to launder the vast sums his network produced. The Mafia had become a corporation, and Luciano was its CEO. But his reign was short-lived. New York's ambitious special prosecutor, Thomas E. Dewey, had built his reputation on breaking rackets and was now determined to bring down the man behind them all. Dewey couldn't tie Luciano directly to bootlegging or murder. Luciano was too careful for that, so he went after him for something else entirely: prostitution. In 1936, Dewey launched a citywide campaign against organised vice. His investigators raided brothels, arrested madams, and flipped witnesses until one name began to repeat: Lucky Luciano. Dewey's case claimed Luciano ran an empire of hundreds of brothels across New York, extorting madams for protection and organising their finances through union fronts. The evidence was circumstantial, the witnesses unreliable, but Dewey's team framed the case as a moral crusade. Newspapers turned Luciano into a symbol of corruption. Editorials called him the king of vice. When the trial opened, reporters filled every seat in the courtroom. Luciano sat calmly through it, dressed in his finest suits, outwardly indifferent. He believed no jury would be able to convict him. He was wrong. On June 7th, 1936, Luciano was found guilty on 62 counts of compulsory prostitution and sentenced to 30 to 50 years at Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, a frozen fortress near the Canadian border that inmates called Little Siberia. He was 38 years old. The king of the underworld was gone. His empire, it seemed, was finished, and the press celebrated his downfall as a victory for law and order, meaning that Dewey's career skyrocketed. But history has a sense of irony, and just 4 years later America would be at war, and in that war, the government would find itself turning back to the very man it had locked away, the man who, from his cell, still commanded loyalty across the docks, the unions, and the underworld. War has a way of resurrecting powerful men, and sometimes it reminds us just how fragile civilization really is, how quickly the systems we depend upon can fall apart. And that idea actually brings me to today's sponsor, Hungry Minds, and their incredible creation, the book, How to Rebuild Civilization. Now, this isn't your average history book, and as you all know, I'm very selective with the sponsorships that I take on my channel, but if you enjoy my videos, then I can pretty much guarantee that you're gonna enjoy this book. It's a hand-illustrated guide to humanity's greatest discoveries, the inventions, materials, and systems that built the modern world from nothing. An encyclopedia of everything that keeps civilization running, from fire, metal and agriculture to engines, printing and electricity, all presented through stunning medieval inspired illustrations and packed with sly humour and hidden references. It's heavy in your hands, beautifully bound, and feels less like a book and more like a relic. What I personally love most is how it blends art, science and philosophy into one visual journey. Each page is a reminder of how fragile and how brilliant human progress really is. It's perfect for anyone who loves history, design, or simply wants a reminder of what makes civilization worth rebuilding. And there's even a secret quest hidden within the pages, a quest that leads to a real-world prize. I won't spoil what that real-world prize is, having done it myself, but you can pick up your own copy using the link in the description and use my code LASTSUPPER10 to get 10% off your order. A big thank you to Hungry Minds for supporting the channel, but now back to New York, to 1942. Civilization wasn't collapsing, but it was certainly cracking under pressure. The docks were in chaos, the Navy was losing ships faster than they could be built, and by the spring of 1942, the Navy's chief intelligence officer, Captain Roscoe McFall, had run out of options. By the spring of 1942, the Navy's chief intelligence officer for the 3rd Naval District, Captain Roscoe McFall, had run out of options. A career officer and veteran of the First World War, he'd built a reputation for discipline and precision, the kind of man who believed that any problem could be solved through order and procedure. But in 1942, those rules no longer applied. New York's waterfront was lawless, the docks were leaking cargo and information, and enemy submarines were destroying Allied ships faster than they could be replaced. The U-boats were strangling the Atlantic supply line, his undercover agents were failing on the docks, and public fear of sabotage was rising. The Navy needed help, not from detectives or soldiers, but from the men who actually controlled the waterfront. So on March the 7th, 1942, Captain McFall met with District Attorney Frank Hogan, one of the most respected prosecutors in New York. Hogan had built his career fighting political corruption and organised crime, and his office had deep connections with law enforcement and labour investigators across the city. When McFall laid out the Navy's growing panic over the docks, Hogan saw that the problem wasn't just military, it was criminal. He recommended involving the Rackets Bureau, a specialised unit that targeted union corruption and extortion on the waterfront, led by Assistant District Attorney Murray Gurfein, a bright, methodical lawyer who understood both the law and the politics of the docks. Gurfein had spent years mapping the tangle of labour unions, front companies, and gangsters that ran the piers. Together, McFall, Hogan and Gurfein conceived an operation that would remain secret for decades. Operation Underworld, a covert alliance between Naval Intelligence, the District Attorney's Office, and the Mafia. McFall assigned command of the operation to Commander Charles Radcliffe Haffenden, who set up headquarters in 2 luxurious suites at the Astor Hotel in Times Square. His unit, officially known as B3, was staffed with linguists and undercover specialists, many of them Italian Americans fluent in Sicilian dialects. Their mission was to infiltrate the waterfront and to root out any threat to national security. But before they could start, Haffenden needed access for his agents, and that meant dealing with the Mafia. The logical entry point was the aforementioned Joseph Sox Lanza, the racketeer who ruled the Fulton fish market. Through Lanza's attorney, Haffenden arranged a secret meeting. The Navy's message was direct. They needed the mob's help protecting American ships from sabotage, and to their surprise, Lanza agreed immediately. Some say it was patriotism, others believe that it was self-preservation, as Lanza was already under investigation and might have seen cooperation as leverage. Whatever his motives, the mobster got to work. By the next morning, he'd called his longtime associate Benjamin Espy, of whom no photographs have survived of, and together they began questioning suppliers, monitoring unusual purchases, and organising fishermen to report suspicious activity at sea. Lanza's network stretched along the Atlantic coast, from Maine to Florida, even into Newfoundland. Fishermen who once smuggled whiskey in Prohibition now watched for submarines in World War II. The Navy's B3 agents began embedding with crews of workers under mob protection, disguised as ordinary deckhands. Lanza supplied them with no-show union cards, fake jobs that allowed them to move freely aboard vessels without suspicion. In effect, the United States Navy was operating under the umbrella of organised crime. The collaboration produced immediate results. Agents uncovered suspicious supply chains, exposed corrupt shipping companies, and quietly broke up suspected espionage cells. One wiretap captured Haffenden and Lanza discussing Labour leader Harry Bridges, rumoured to be a communist agitator. Lanza told him, "You won't have any trouble, I'll see to that." Days later, a group of Lanza's enforcers ambushed Bridges in a dance hall and beat him half to death. But Lanza's influence only reached so far. As the Mafia was divided into 5 families and each family owned its own territory, they needed to speak with whoever ran the whole thing. Because to secure Brooklyn's docks, Huffington needed the approval of Albert Anastasia, underboss in the Mangano crime family. To control the West Side piers, he needed the cooperation of the famously corrupt Joseph P. Ryan, who was president of the International Longshoremen's Association and who was already in the pockets of the Hell's Kitchen crime boss Eddie McGrath. He might have had the cooperation of Sox Lanza, but that was just a small portion of the waterfront. When Huffington asked Lanza who could truly unify the underworld, Lanza's answer was simple. Only one man can snap the whip over the whole mob, and that man was in a cell 300 miles north of New York, Lucky Luciano. And so, the Navy began preparing to make a deal with the devil. Reaching Luciano wasn't simple. He was serving his sentence in Dannemora prison, locked away behind concrete and snowdrifts. But Commander Huffington was desperate. Each day more ships went down and morale in the Navy fell with them. Through Luciano's lawyer, Moses Polikoff, Huffington reached out to the one man who might convince Luciano to cooperate, Meyer Lansky. Lansky was the perfect intermediary. He was still free, still influential, and fiercely anti-Nazi. Even before America entered the war, Lansky's man had fought off German-American Bund rallies in New York, storming halls, breaking banners, and on one occasion throwing Nazi sympathisers out of windows. We attacked them in the halls, Lansky said. There were fistfights everywhere. I've done a full video on the Mafia fighting off the German-American Bund or the Nazis in America, which I'll leave a link to in the description if you fancy watching that. Working through Polikoff and Assistant District Attorney Gerfine, Lansky arranged to visit Luciano, but Dannemora's isolation made secret meetings nearly impossible. If Luciano was to help, he'd have to be moved closer to the city. Huffington wrote a confidential letter to Corrections Commissioner John Lyons, explaining Operation Underworld and requesting Luciano's transfer to Great Meadow Prison near Albany. Lyons agreed, and Huffington destroyed the letter afterwards to erase any record. On May the 12th, 1942, Luciano and 8 other inmates were quietly moved to Great Meadow. Their cells at Dannemora were immediately filled by new arrivals to prevent suspicion. Within weeks, Lansky and Polikoff visited to brief Luciano. The mob boss listened in silence as Lansky explained the Navy's proposal. The government wanted his help securing the docks, stopping sabotage, and uniting the fractured underworld of the docks under a single command. Luciano had questions. There was no offer of release, no reduction of sentence, and as an Italian-born non-citizen, he risked deportation to fascist Italy if the deal ever became public. But he also saw opportunity. Prison had slightly weakened his control. Working with the Navy would give him a reason to communicate with his men again and possibly win him leniency. And so Luciano was in on Operation Underworld. On June the 4th, 1942, a strategy meeting was held at Great Meadow with Lansky, Polikoff, and Sox Lanza. Luciano authorised Lanza to act in his name on the streets, an enormous gesture in the Mafia world. Lansky would oversee coordination, serving as Luciano's voice between the Navy and the underworld. Almost overnight, the Mafia aligned itself behind the war effort. Joseph P. Ryan, head of the International Longshoremen's Association, and his ruthless enforcer, Johnny Cockeye Dunn, brother-in-law of Eddie McGrath, pledged their cooperation. On the Brooklyn side, Albert Anastasia, fiercely loyal to Lucky Luciano ever since Luciano had eliminated a witness to one of Anastasia's dockside killings, also threw his support behind the mission. Although it's suspected from many that this was Anastasia's grand plan to repay his boss, started by the fire of the SS Normandy. With that, the Navy now had access to both the New York and Brooklyn waterfronts, the most vital shipping arteries in America. And by late 1942, Commander Haffenden's B-3 unit controlled a sprawling network of informants, dockworkers, and gang enforcers across the two waterfronts. Under Mafia protection, the New York waterfront grew silent. Not a single confirmed act of sabotage or major labour dispute occurred for the rest of the war. Operation Underworld had worked. But before it was over, it would reach far beyond the docks of New York and Brooklyn. It would reach all the way across the Atlantic to the invasion of Europe itself. By the beginning of 1943, the balance of the war was finally beginning to shift. In North Africa, Field Marshal Montgomery had broken Rommel's Afrika Korps at El Alamein, and American forces under Dwight Eisenhower were pushing west from Morocco and Algeria. The Axis armies were being squeezed between two advancing fronts. On January the 14th, Allied leaders gathered in Casablanca to decide their next move. For 10 days, Winston Churchill argued passionately with Franklin Roosevelt. The British believed that the Allies were not yet ready for a direct invasion of France. Instead, Churchill insisted striking what he called the soft underbelly of Europe, meaning Italy. And he got his way. The conference closed with a decision that would transform Operation Underworld from a domestic security effort into an international espionage operation. The next target would be Sicily. The invasion, codenamed Operation Husky, would become the largest amphibious assault in history, involving over 160,000 troops, 3,000 ships, and 4,000 aircraft. But there was one major problem. The Allies knew almost nothing about Sicily itself. American intelligence lacked accurate maps, photographs, or reliable information about coastal defences, roads, or airfields. For decades, Britain had dominated intelligence operations across the Mediterranean, leaving the US Navy with virtually no groundwork of its own. Sicily was, effectively, a blank page, but the Mafia knew every inch of it. Commander Charles Haffenden, still running Operation Underworld from his Astor Hotel base in Manhattan, saw an opportunity. If the Mafia could secure the New York docks, then perhaps it could also open a back door into Sicily. He created a new subunit within Naval Intelligence, the F-Target section, tasked with gathering everything possible about the island of Sicily. Early in 1943, Meyer Lansky once again visited Great Meadow Prison, carrying a new proposal to Lucky Luciano. The Navy needed information, maps, photographs, harbour schematics, and the names of local contacts. Most importantly, they needed a list of Sicilian mafiosi who could assist the invasion. Luciano didn't hesitate. Sicily was his homeland, he had a lot of family still living there, and through his narcotics network and old world connections, he had lines of communication stretching deep into the island's villages. He offered to take command of the operation personally, volunteering to be parachuted into Sicily to organise resistance. The military high command immediately vetoed the idea. The release of one of America's most notorious criminals behind enemy lines was unthinkable. Instead, Luciano would coordinate from prison, and thus, from behind bars. Lucky Luciano was about to become a key player in the Allied invasion of Europe. To gather intelligence, Luciano enlisted his trusted lieutenants. Chief among them was Joe Adonis, a handsome and calculating racketeer whose spotless legal record concealed a lifetime of organised crime. Adonis worked with Vincent Mangano, the aging Mafia don who oversaw Brooklyn's docks through his underboss Albert Anastasia, and maintained long-standing business ties to Sicily through his import company. Mangano's legitimate trade provided perfect cover for espionage. Cargo ships and fishing trawlers became conduits for coded messages. Over several months, Adonis and Mangano brought hundreds of Italian immigrants who worked on the docks into their very own interrogation office at the Office of Naval Intelligence for questioning. Some came willingly, eager to see Mussolini's fascists destroyed. Others, who supported Mussolini, needed encouragement. Lansky later recalled the process. Sometimes the Sicilians were very nervous, he said. Joe would mention Lucky's name, say he'd given orders to talk. If they still hesitated, Joe would stop smiling and say, "Lucky won't be pleased if you're not helpful." The method worked. Information poured in, everything from port schematics to the political loyalties of village priests. To consolidate this flood of data, the F-Target section brought in George Tarbox, a talented cartographer and artist. Over several weeks, Tarbox built an enormous 4x6-foot relief map of Sicily, covered by a transparent overlay marked with strategic targets in India ink, airfields, ammunition depots, power stations, troop concentrations, and harbour depths. Every detail mattered: which roads could support tanks, which bridges were mined, which towns were hostile and which might welcome the invaders. But the most valuable intelligence wasn't geographical, it was personal. The Mafia's network identified a roster of Sicilian bosses who had survived or gone underground after Mussolini's purge of the Mafia in the 1920s. The dictator had sent his notorious Iron Prefect, Cesare Mori, to crush organised crime with brutality. Thousands were arrested, tortured, or forced into exile. Entire families were held hostage, and by 1928, over 11,000 suspected mafiosi had been imprisoned. The campaign worked. Temporarily, the Mafia was shattered, but it never forgave. Those who escaped vowed vengeance. Now, in 1943, they were about to get their chance. Among those named in the intelligence files was Carlogero Vizzini, better known as Don Carlo, the most powerful Mafia boss in central Sicily. He ruled from the small town of Vialba, perched on the inland plateau that linked the island's western and eastern coasts. Vialba sat at a vital crossroads, the main road running from Palermo in the north to Agrigento in the south, intersecting with the route east towards Caltani Setar and Ennar. Whoever controlled Vialba controlled the movement of troops, supplies, and information through the heart of Sicily. Luciano sent word to Vizzini through intermediaries: the Americans are coming, and help them. Across central and western Sicily, messages spread quietly through old channels of loyalty and family. Local Mafia bosses instructed their men to prepare, to gather intelligence, identify collaborators, and be ready to assist the Allied forces when the invasion came. For the first time in years, the Sicilian Mafia was moving with purpose and unity. They understood what this moment meant. Mussolini's power was collapsing, and the Allied invasion offered the chance to reclaim everything they had lost under fascist rule. By the summer of 1943, Operation Husky was ready. The maps were complete, the contacts secured, and the Mafia's cooperation assured. The first American soldiers to set foot on Sicilian soil would have allies waiting, men who knew every road, every hillside, and every enemy collaborator. Around the same time, Operation Underworld in New York City had achieved its objectives. The docks were secure, no major sabotage had occurred, and the intelligence pipeline was running smoothly. Commander Charles Haffenden now wanted to test his system in combat. His idea was bold: send a small team of naval operatives, the very men who had organised the docks, into the war zone itself. Naval Intelligence approved. 2 covert commando units were formed from Operation Underworld's ranks and flown to Mers El Kabir, Algeria, the Allies' main naval base in North Africa, for counterintelligence corps training. The program was brutal: demolition, infiltration, sabotage, and survival behind enemy lines. They couldn't be sent to Sicily yet because the island was still under Axis control, but these men were being prepared for it. Each team carried copies of the Mafia-provided contact lists, names of local figures in Sicily who could be trusted, bribed, or approached. The intelligence proved accurate in roughly 40% of cases, an extraordinary success rate in the chaos of wartime espionage. One name on the list stood out: Vito Genovese. Once one of Lucky Luciano's top lieutenants, Genovese had fled the United States in 1937 on a murder charge. In Italy, he reinvented himself as a fascist sympathizer, donating $250,000 to Mussolini's party. But as the Allies advanced, Genovese switched sides overnight, offering his services as an interpreter and advisor to the US Army. His fluency and charm earned him a position within the Allied military government, where he became one of its most trusted civilian aides, a gangster turned wartime bureaucrat. The invasion plan called for simultaneous landings along the island's southern coast. British and Canadian forces would come ashore on the east, driving towards Messina. American forces would land on the west and push inland through Gela and Licata. Sicily was defended by more than 300,000 Axis troops, including seasoned German panzer divisions. A failed landing could have resulted in catastrophic losses, but the Allies had 2 decisive advantages: deception and betrayal. Through Operation Mincemeat, British intelligence executed one of the most audacious deception plots of World War II. 2 officers from MI5's Naval Intelligence Division obtained the body of Glyndor Michael, which I'm sorry I have to blur. He was a homeless man who died after ingesting rat poison, and the MI5 transformed him into a fictitious Royal Marine officer, Captain William Martin. They dressed Michael's corpse in uniform and filled his pockets with personal effects: a photograph of a fiancée, love letters, ticket stubs, the ordinary debris of life. But the key items upon his person were forged documents, correspondence between 2 British generals suggesting that the Allies planned to invade Greece and Sardinia, with Sicily only serving as a diversion. The body was released off the coast of Spain, and when it washed ashore, it quickly fell into German hands. And thanks to Operation Underworld, the Allies now possess something absolutely invaluable: a human network inside Sicily itself, reliable intelligence, local guides, and sympathetic Mafia contacts scattered across the island. On the night of July the 9th, 1943, the greatest amphibious armada in history left port. More than 2,500 ships carrying 160 troops, 600 tanks, 14,000 vehicles and 1,800 artillery pieces sailed through the Mediterranean towards Sicily. Just before midnight on July the 10th, Allied battleships opened fire, shaking the coast with thunderous bombardment. Minutes later, waves of landing craft surged towards the beaches, their engines muffled by the roar of the guns. Operation Husky was commanded by General Dwight Eisenhower, with two fiercely ambitious subordinates leading the ground assault. General George S. Patton commanding the American 7th Army, and General Bernard Montgomery leading the British 8th. Montgomery's forces landed on Sicily's southeastern beaches, advancing north along the island's narrow eastern corridor towards Catania and Messina, the gateway to mainland Italy. To the west, Patton's army came ashore between Licata and Gela, tasked with securing the island's interior, capturing the port city of Palermo, and protecting Montgomery's flank as the two forces converged on Messina from opposite sides. On the beaches, that plan fell to two of Patton's most capable field commanders, General Lucian Truscott leading the battle-hardened 3rd Infantry Division, and General Terry Della Mesa Allen commanding the 1st Infantry Division, also known as the Big Red One. By dawn, 181 Allied troops were ashore. Among them were Commander Haffenden's intelligence officers, veterans of New York's criminal underworld who were now operating in one of the most significant military campaigns of the century. They were there to test whether Operation Underworld's intelligence and the Mafia's cooperation could survive the chaos of the war. They came ashore in the dark under intense machine gun fire, landing between Torre de Garfe and Puente do Roque, with Truscott's 3rd Infantry Division and a Ranger Battalion hugging the sand as bullets tore through the ocean. The Operation Underworld intelligence officers moved fast, grenades, short bursts, and then silence in the hills. When the beachhead held, the intelligence officers did something no line officer would ever recommend. They vanished. In a slit trench, they stripped off their naval khaki and pulled on rough wool trousers with cotton shirts. With dark hair, fluent Italian, and scuffed shoes, they could pass for two more Sicilian peasants fleeing from the gunfire. Their mission was simple and perilous: make contact with the island's mafia, gather intelligence on German defences, and prepare networks for sabotage if the battle stalled. What followed sits somewhere between field report and legend. Working from confidential lists compiled in New York, names that came out of Mangano's import office and Joe Adonis's interrogation room, the operatives knocked on doors no uniformed soldier could approach. Mafia and Lucky Luciano became, as one agent later said, passwords. People who had been silent for 20 years suddenly smiled. Doors that were bolted at dusk swung open. Shortly after the landings, one intelligence officer called Paul Alfieri was tipped off by a young Sicilian boy about a hidden cache of Italian naval intelligence documents inside a commandeered seaside villa. Storming a guarded HQ was suicide, but waiting meant destruction of those documents. Alfieri chose a third option, organising a raid with locals who weren't soldiers or partisans, but mafia gunmen who owed favours traced back to New York. Under the cover of darkness, they approached the villa. Whether the guards were bribed, clubbed, or worse was never recorded. What matters is that Alfieri got inside. One of the mafioso was predictably a trained safecracker, and he blew open the strongbox, and Paul Alfieri walked out with codebooks, maps, radio schedules, minefield charts, and operational dispositions for Italian and German naval forces across the whole of the Mediterranean. The intelligence saved ships and lives, plotting safe lanes around mines, anticipating interceptions before they materialised. For this, Alfieri received the Legion of Merit. His citation, careful and dry, never named a single mafiosi. As the Allied advance gathered momentum, resistance across Sicily began to collapse. Within weeks, the offensive was sweeping north through the island's hills and valleys, American and British columns driving the Axis towards Messina. To the east, Montgomery's 8th Army pushed up the coast towards Catania and the Straits of Messina. To the west, Patton's 7th Army struck out across the interior, capturing Palermo on July the 22nd after a lightning 12-day campaign. The victory was more symbolic than strategic. The Axis was already retreating towards the mainland, but it gave the Americans momentum and Patton the headlines he craved. Montgomery and his forces were grinding forward through fortified positions in the Etna Massif, slowly suffering heavy casualties with every small gain. Patton saw daylight. He drove east along cratered roads, over wrecked bridges and mined culverts, determined to beat the British into Messina. German rearguards fought, fell back and fought again, shelling crossings and bottlenecks. But Allied momentum, reinforced by deception from Operation Mincemeat and local guidance from Sicilian contacts, carried through. For the Operation Underworld operatives, the speed of the advance made their insurgency plans irrelevant. The Mafia shifted from combat to coordination, navigation, liaison, and civic order. They became guides in the hills, interpreters in town halls, and fixers who could sort food queues and calm tempers when rations ran short. Here the logic of AMGOT, the Allied military government, met Sicilian reality. With few Italian speakers and even fewer trustworthy officials, civil affairs officers leaned on the men the towns already obeyed. In place after place, those men were the same figures that were once jailed or exiled under Mussolini's purge. Mafia members that were reintroduced as anti-fascists. Vito Genovese, now working as an interpreter for AMGOT, smoothed the way, recommending mayors and police chiefs who owed their careers to old loyalties. In Villalba, Don Carlo Vizzini greeted the Americans as liberators and stepped seamlessly into local power. He had been forewarned by Luciano's network and his timing was perfect. Within days, the Mafia was not only restored but legitimized, its men now allies in rebuilding a liberated Sicily. By mid-August, the end was scripted. The Germans had evacuated the bulk of their forces across the Strait of Messina, a controlled retreat under smoke and artillery that denied the Allies a decisive encirclement. On the 17th of August 1943, Patton entered Messina hours before Montgomery. He staged the photograph, chin up in the piazza, the rival arriving to find flags already hung. In 38 days, Sicily had fallen. The Axis lost over 160,000 men, killed, wounded, captured or evacuated, whereas Allied casualties were roughly 20,000. 15 days earlier, on the 25th of July, Mussolini had been overthrown and arrested. The strategic door into Italy was open and the discreet scaffolding of Operation Underworld had held. With victory came secrecy. The Navy began to burn paper. Files were shredded, memos were culled, and sources were sealed. The public appetite for victory would not stretch to collusion with racketeers, careers would not survive it, but promises, spoken or implied, do not burn so easily. On the same day Messina fell, on the 17th of August 1943, Lucky Luciano petitioned for executive clemency, arguing that his cooperation had aided dock security and the Sicilian campaign. The Navy, alarmed at the optics, refused to confirm. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office, involved since the beginning, quietly validated facts without trumpeting conclusions. And for Luciano, pressure worked by increments. On the 3rd of January 1946, the New York State Parole Board unanimously recommended to Governor Thomas Dewey, Luciano's old nemesis, that the sentence be commuted with immediate deportation. Dewey agreed the very next day. His carefully phrased statement conceded that upon America's entry into the war, Luciano's aid had been sought in inducing others to provide information, though the actual value of information procured is not clear. After 10 years served of a 30 to 50 year term, the most powerful gangster in America walked towards a ship and exile. On the 9th of February 1946, exactly 4 years after the Normandy burned, Luciano boarded the SS Laura Keene in Brooklyn. Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello came to the pier, so did a small crowd that cheered as the lines were cast. He sailed not for home, for the word had never fit him, but for banishment. He would not meddle in organised crime again. Or so the paperwork promised. Within months, Luciano slipped to Havana, 90 miles from Florida and a lifetime closer to his old business. From Cuba, he began knitting lines again, messages to the 5 families, meetings in hotel suites, narcotics routes mapped across the hemisphere. When the United States protested, Havana forced him out, and by 1947 he was back in Naples, where he would live the rest of his days. From Italy, he remained a fixed point in a moving underworld. He helped engineer the French connection, moving morphine from Turkey through Marseille and heroin across the Atlantic to New York and beyond. American bosses made pilgrimages to his table, half homage and half board meeting, and he never stopped telling the story in which he was central, the man who secured the docks, opened Sicily, and nudged a dictator off his throne. Operation Underworld had achieved what its architects needed. The New York waterfront stayed quiet, sabotage did not cripple mobilization, Husky landed with more clarity and fewer surprises than it might otherwise have. Whether the Mafia's contribution was decisive or merely just slightly useful will always spark argument. What is certain is the ledger on the other side. Luciano won his freedom, and in Sicily, men broken by fascism were restored to office and influence. And in America, the post-war mob emerged richer, more connected, and more confident than ever before. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the Mafia stood stronger than at any point in a generation. In Sicily, Allied civil affairs officers, short on language, time and trustworthy personnel, leaned on the men that whole towns already obeyed. On paper they were described as anti-fascists, which many of them genuinely were, having been jailed or exiled by Mussolini's police. In practice, they were also seasoned criminals who resumed the work that they understood best, controlling councils and police, arbitrating labour, and taxing the flow of goods that kept civilians alive in a ruined economy. Don Carlo Vizzini rose as the island's most visible broker, mastering the black market in food and fuel, arranging accommodations between politicians and clans, and positioning Sicilian networks to dominate the heroin pipelines that would run over the next decades from Turkey through Marseille to New York. The American occupation in Italy lasted into 1947, and during those fragile years the Mafia embedded itself in local patronage. Elections turned on blocks of votes delivered by bosses to pro-American, anti-communist parties in exchange for protection, contracts, and impunity. Washington, intent on denying Italy to the communists, tolerated arrangements it might otherwise have condemned. Across the Atlantic, the 5 families emerged from wartime richer and better connected. Black markets had fattened treasuries, dock protection had purchased influence with union leaders, stevedores, and municipal fixers. Meyer Lansky, whose quiet diplomacy helped coordinate the Navy's waterfront experiment, expanded gambling in Havana and strengthened the financial arteries of the drug trade linking Sicily and Marseille to the eastern seaboard. Frank Costello, acting head during Luciano's exile, became the Prime Minister of the underworld, a man who could soften investigations with a phone call and turn rivalries into arrests. Albert Anastasia maintained his iron grip on the waterfront, enforcing order by fear. Vito Genovese, after working with Allied forces in Italy, returned to the States and clawed back influence until he controlled the old Luciano interests that would eventually bear his name, the Genovese crime family. By the early 1950s, the Mafia's reach extended far beyond gambling dens and waterfront rackets. They had friends in city halls, quiet leverage in police precincts, and heavy hands on the levers of labour that moved American freight. On the docks of New York and now New Jersey, no cargo was loaded, no union vote cast, and no shipment unloaded without the Mafia's say-so. They skimmed pension funds, laundered public contracts, and treated the city's infrastructure like their own private estate. And they enjoyed an unusual kind of protection. The very agencies best placed to investigate them, the Navy, Army Intelligence, and prosecutors who had relied on their help during the war, understood that a full accounting of those arrangements would expose too much on both sides, so the Mafia machine ran with minimal friction. Heroin seeped into American neighborhoods, labor racketeering financed political campaigns, witnesses disappeared, grand juries collapsed, and the silence of the waterfront outlived the war itself. Yet the legacy of that wartime bargain lingered like smoke. Organised crime in both America and Sicily had survived catastrophe and re-emerged stronger, more organised, and more deeply embedded in legitimate power than ever before. What began as a desperate measure to protect the docks had matured into a parallel system of authority, one that thrived precisely because it had once been invited inside the walls of the government. Through the 1950s and 60s, the Mafia functioned as its own invisible government. Construction projects, trucking routes, garment factories and labour unions all paid tribute to the five families. Politicians relied on their money and their votes, police chiefs relied on their payoffs, and the same organisation that had once worked hand in glove with Naval Intelligence now dictated who worked, who ate, and who disappeared. The Code of Omerta, the ancient oath of silence, kept law enforcement out and ensured obedience through fear. For the men at the top, men like Vito Genovese, Frank Costello, and Carlo Gambino, the war had legitimised them as patriotic businessmen. That legitimacy, however tainted, gave them access to political donors, union leaders, and even judges. The lines between politics and organised crime blurred into habit. However, by the late 1970s, the landscape had changed. A new generation of federal prosecutors had learned from decades of frustration. They understood that arresting individual mobsters achieved nothing if the hierarchy remained intact. The weapons they needed arrived in 1970, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, or, as it was more commonly known, RICO. RICO allowed prosecutors to treat entire criminal enterprises as single conspiracies. It meant that a man giving orders in a suite at the Waldorf Astoria could be charged for crimes committed in the street by men he had never met. For the first time ever, the bosses themselves were vulnerable. Their assets could be frozen, their businesses seized, their money traced and confiscated. And perhaps most importantly, the law gave prosecutors leverage to flip soldiers into witnesses. One by one, the walls of silence began to crack. Facing life sentences, lower-ranking mobsters chose cooperation over loyalty. They traded omerta for immunity and relocation under witness protection. The FBI, working with US attorneys in New York, built sweeping cases that revealed the structure of the Mafia in unprecedented detail, its finances, its labour rackets, its political contacts. In 1985, the Mafia Commission trial struck at the organisation's heart. The heads of the Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Colombo and Bonanno families, the same 5 families Luciano had unified half a century earlier, were tried together and convicted under RICO. The sentences were long, the message was unmistakable, and the age of untouchability was over. Through the 1990s and into the early 2000s, federal pressure only intensified. Informants like Sammy the Bull Gravano brought down once invincible dons. Labour unions were purged, construction firms dismantled, and entire families reduced to scattered remnants under constant surveillance. The Grand Commission system that Luciano had designed in 1931 was dead, buried by the same bureaucracy it had once outmanoeuvred. Today, the 5 families do still exist, but their influence is a shadow of what it once was. And with the introduction of witness protection, that ancient oath of omerta wasn't upheld by everyone. The era where mobsters could stroll into the Waldorf Astoria and demand tribute from legitimate businessmen is long gone. The modern mafia endures a legend, a warning, a memory, a brand. Sicily followed a parallel but darker trajectory. By the 1950s, the mafia networks controlled agriculture, construction, and the black market trade that fed Italy's post-war recovery. The heroin pipeline that linked Marseille to New York ran directly through Sicilian ports, and by the 1970s, Cosa Nostra had extended its reach into Rome itself, corrupting police, judges, and members of parliament. When the Italian state finally confronted them in the 1980s and 1990s, the cost was brutal. Judges Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino, who had dedicated their lives to prosecuting the mafia through landmark cases, were murdered in bombings just weeks apart in 1992. Their assassinations shocked the country and sparked a wave of public outrage that forced the government into unprecedented action. Thousands of mobsters were arrested, billions in assets were seized, and entire clans confined to isolation prisons. And yet, even crushed and dispersed, the mafia endured. It adapted, trading gunfire for boardrooms and intimidation for investment. In Sicily and America alike, organised crime proved less a structure than a tradition, a system that could contract, mutate and survive under pressure. The consequences of Operation Underworld rippled through all of this. The wartime collaboration between organised crime and the United States government had granted the mafia something no amount of violence or money could have ever purchased: credibility. In 1942, that credibility was transactional, and by the 1950s, it was structural. The Navy's logic had been simple enough. German U-boats were sinking Allied shipping at an alarming rate. The Normandy fire had exposed the vulnerability of New York Harbour. Undercover agents had failed to infiltrate the docks, and if sabotage was even a possibility, then partnering with the men who controlled the waterfront looked like grim pragmatism. But history complicates that logic. No evidence ever proved that enemy agents sabotaged the Normandy. The FBI called it an accident, an errant welder's spark in a ship crammed with flammable materials. Captured German records showed no plan to attack American ports. Even the Duquesne spy ring, the largest espionage case of the war, had talked about sabotage and never acted. Some historians argue that Albert Anastasia engineered the fire himself, manufacturing a crisis only the Mafia could solve to get his boss out of prison. It was the classic protection racket on a national scale, create fear, then sell calm. There isn't any conclusive proof, but Luciano later bragged about it. His boasts, however, are unreliable. But the timing is hard to ignore. A spectacular blaze in February, and by spring, Naval Intelligence was sitting down with the racketeers. What cannot be disputed, however, is the record that followed. Throughout the remainder of the war, there were no confirmed acts of sabotage on the New York waterfront. No crippling strikes, no unexplained fires that threatened mobilization. To some, that vindicated the partnership. To others, it merely proved that the threat had been overstated to begin with. As one naval officer later admitted, the Mafia's grip on the docks had been so complete that the Navy's reasoning was circular. We must work with the men who control the docks because we have allowed them to control the docks. Operation Underworld, in that light, looks less like a strategic necessity and more like an expedient shortcut around a long-term failure of governance. In Sicily, the consequences were even more profound. The wartime reinstatement of Mafia bosses as anti-fascist administrators became a foundation for post-war power. The men the Allies had viewed as stabilizers became, within years, the gatekeepers of commerce and politics. The bridge between the American and Sicilian underworld, strengthened out of wartime convenience, became a highway for narcotics, capital, and influence. Even if the United States had never worked with the Mafia, organized crime would have pursued profit in vice and drugs. But the wartime collaboration conferred something far more valuable: legitimacy, access, and the sense of a debt owed. That debt complicated prosecutions and emboldened claims to impunity for decades. For more than 30 years, Operation Underworld existed as rumour and boast. Files were incinerated, memoranda locked away, participants cautioned to silence. Luciano talked freely, claiming he had won the war single-handedly. Meyer Lansky, in his later years, confirmed cooperation with Naval Intelligence, but offered little detail. The story remained a whispered legend, half truth, half myth. In 1954, seeking to justify his controversial commutation of Luciano's sentence, Governor Thomas Dewey authorized an independent review. Attorney William B. Herlands interviewed witnesses, reviewed testimony, and produced a 101-page report summarizing more than 3,000 pages of classified material. Its conclusions were cautious but unmistakable. Naval Intelligence had indeed worked with Luciano's circle to secure the docks and gather intelligence for the Sicilian campaign. The report was classified and quietly shelved. It resurfaced only in 1977, when researcher Rodney Campbell uncovered it among Dewey's papers and published the Luciano Project. The revelation ignited headlines. The Navy initially denied everything, then conceded that some contact of limited value had happened. As more documents emerged, denial softened to qualification. Yes, there had been cooperation, but no, it had not decided the war. Luciano's death in 1962 closed a personal chapter, but not the story. On January the 26th, he collapsed at Naples airport after meeting an American producer about a film based on his life. 16 years barred from the United States, he returned home in death. At Cavalry Cemetery in Queens, more than 1,000 mourners gathered, family, old friends and gangsters, and federal agents watched from a distance. His mausoleum is a grand affair, marble, ornate, impossible to miss, and in that at least it mirrors the life he lived. He had helped invent the modern American Mafia, steered it through its violent adolescence into corporate adulthood, and through a war's odd necessities, briefly made himself useful to the very government that imprisoned him. The empire he left behind outlasted him by decades. stretching from New York to Havana to Palermo. It poisoned neighborhoods with narcotics, corrupted unions, and blurred the moral boundaries of the state that had once used it. Operation Underworld achieved its purpose. The docks stayed quiet, the ships kept sailing, the invasion succeeded, but the cost was lasting. In fighting tyranny abroad, the United States had struck a bargain with tyranny at home. The Mafia helped win the war, but in doing so, it also won something for itself: legitimacy, influence, and time. And for the generations that followed, the ones that came long after the war ended, the benefits of that deal between the Mafia and the United States remained for all to see, no matter how much the government tried to deny its effectiveness. Remaining unbiased as I often do, it did stop any potential sabotage on the docks, whether Normandy was or was not a sabotage, and it softened the blow of Operation Husky and the Allied invasion of Sicily, and I think we'll leave it at that. Thanks so much for watching. Please give the video a like if you enjoyed it and consider subscribing, and please feel welcome to join my Discord server. It's a free app where we discuss these stories in detail, and perhaps a place where we'll discuss the effectiveness of Operation Underworld as well. And it's also a place where you'll get to vote on future videos, the thumbnails I use, and much more. So if that sounds of interest to you, I'll leave the link to join in a pinned comment. If not, it's absolutely fine. And as always, I shall see you in the next one. Thanks a lot for watching.